The Bible says Jesus had brothers. Not once, 4 times, with proper names, in 4 different books, written by 4 different authors, across different decades. James, Joseph, Judas, Simon, plus sisters, mentioned in the plural but never named. And the oldest document in the entire New Testament, written barely 15 years after the crucifixion, by someone who met these people face to face, calls James the brother of the Lord. No footnote, no clarification, no asterisk explaining that brother here actually means cousin. The brother of the Lord, as the most natural way to identify that man. So the question is not whether the Bible mentions the brothers of Jesus. It does. The question is how an institution built a 16th century denial of something the sacred text itself repeats 4 times. And the answer, which lies in a single Greek word that Paul knew perfectly well and chose not to use, is what this video is going to show you. What you will find here is not an opinion. It is the method Baruch Spinoza inaugurated nearly 4 centuries ago, reading sacred texts exactly as what they are. Human documents written in specific languages without allowing later doctrine to tell the text what it has to say. Let us start with the evidence. All of it. Because it is not 1 or 2 texts. It is 4 plus 1 external source with no theological interest in the matter whatsoever. The first text is in the Gospel of Mark, the oldest of the 4 canonical Gospels. The people of Nazareth react to Jesus preaching in the synagogue with a question loaded with familiarity. Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? 4 brothers named one by one, sisters mentioned in the plural at least 2, by the people who had watched them all grow up together. In the oldest gospel, this is not a detail buried in a genealogy. It is the people of Jesus' own hometown describing him by his family exactly as any small community would describe a neighbor they had known for decades. The Gospel of Matthew repeats almost the same list in the same words. 2 Gospels, same names, no ambiguity. But the most important testimony is not in any gospel. It is in a letter. Paul of Tarsus is by far the earliest source in the New Testament. His letters were written in the 50s of the 1st century, just 15 or 20 years after the crucifixion, decades before the Gospel of Mark was composed. Paul did not receive his information through oral tradition passed down through several generations. He met the people he writes about in person. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul describes his first visit to Jerusalem after his conversion. He lists who he met there. And he writes something that, in his time, needed no special clarification because it was simply the most natural way to identify that person. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. No parenthetical explanation. No note saying he was actually a cousin. No clarification that brother should be understood in a spiritual sense. The Lord's brother, written by someone who met him. The third text comes from the Gospel of John, the latest and most theologically developed of the 4. His brothers pressure him almost mockingly to go to Jerusalem and show himself publicly during the Feast of Tabernacles. The text explicitly states that his brothers did not believe in him. It is the tension of a family divided by belief, something anyone who has had a religious conviction that their relatives did not share would recognize immediately. The fourth text is in the Acts of the Apostles. After the Ascension, the disciples gather to pray together with the women, with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers. The same brothers who earlier did not believe in him now appear integrated into the nascent community alongside the mother of Jesus, as a family that went through something enormous and came out the other side together. 4 texts, 4 authors, different decades, all saying the same thing. Now the external source, the most revealing of all. Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian who wrote for the Roman court in the second half of the 1st century. He was not a Christian. He had no interest in promoting Christianity or defending any of its doctrines. He was an outside observer recording the political and religious events of his time. In his Jewish Antiquities written around the year 93, Josephus records how the high priest Ananus took advantage of a power vacuum between Roman governors to convene a tribunal and condemn James, the brother of Jesus who was called Christ. No special clarification. No note saying cousin or relative. Brother. Written by someone with no theological reason to say it that way. Write in the comments, what do you think after hearing this? And tell us what country you are watching from. From the United States, from the United Kingdom, from Australia, from Canada, from anywhere you were taught a different version of these texts. Subscribe now. What comes in this video and the ones ahead goes exactly where this exploration is pointing. Without your subscription, the algorithm simply will not show them to you. Share this video with someone who has asked this question. Not to convince them of anything. To give them the evidence they always deserve to have. Before examining how the church built its response, there is something about James himself that changes the weight of all this evidence. James was not a minor figure, not a name on a list. He was the most powerful figure in early Jerusalem, Christianity more authoritative than Peter himself in several episodes of the book of Acts. When Peter miraculously escapes from prison, his first instruction is to tell James, not John, not any other apostle, James, as if James was already at that moment the reference authority of the community. At the Council of Jerusalem, the first great doctrinal debate of Christianity, over whether Gentile converts needed to be circumcised, it is James who pronounces the final judgment that settles the question, with more weight at that moment than Peter or Paul. Josephus describes his death in the year 62 with detail that reveals how publicly significant he was. The high priest Ananus convened an illegal tribunal to condemn him. The execution provoked such a reaction among the most respected Jews of Jerusalem that they complained to Roman authorities. His death was considered unjust even by people who were not followers of Jesus. The community closest in time and space to the events, the one that knew the actual participants, was led for years by someone identified consistently by friends and enemies alike as the brother of the Lord. By Paul in his letters, by Josephus in his history, by the early Christian tradition recorded by Eusebius of Caesarea. That is an uncomfortable fact to explain if the brotherhood never actually existed. There is something in the texts themselves worth dwelling on, something no later doctrine would have invented deliberately, because it works against the image that doctrine was trying to build. Mark, the oldest gospel, preserves a scene in chapter 3 that is almost impossible to fabricate retrospectively. The mother and brothers of Jesus go together to find him because word had gotten out that he was out of his mind. Worried, as any family would worry about one of their own who had abandoned the family business, started gathering crowds, and was generating rumors that reached back home. It is ordinary domestic tension, the kind of detail that survives in early texts precisely because nobody filtered it. Nobody asked whether that image of a worried and skeptical family fit the doctrine being constructed, because when Mark wrote this, that doctrine did not yet exist. Biblical scholars call this the criterion of embarrassment. When a text preserves something that works against the narrative interests of those writing it, that something is more likely to be authentic. Nobody invents the disbelief of the own brothers of a figure they are trying to present as divine. The most uncomfortable texts are the most reliable ones. And the texts about the brothers of Jesus are exactly the most uncomfortable. Now, the central question of the entire video, the one that makes it impossible to ignore what the evidence is saying. The Gospels and Paul's letters are written in Greek, not in Hebrew, not in Aramaic, in Greek. First century Greek. First century Greek had a specific word for brother, adelphos, and it had a completely different and specific word for cousin, anepsios. Two different words for two different relationships, with no possible ambiguity in the language in which these texts were written. We know the New Testament authors knew and used the word anepsios, cousin, because Paul himself uses it in his letter to the Colossians when presenting Mark as the cousin of Barnabas. He writes it with complete precision, anepsios of Barnabas, the cousin of Barnabas. The same Paul, the same author, who in his letter to the Galatians called James the brother of the Lord, using adelphos, not anepsios, brother, not cousin. If Paul had the precise word for cousin readily available and used it in another context, why did he choose the word for brother when speaking of James? The simplest answer is the most honest, because James was the brother of Jesus, and Paul called things by their name. First century Greek distinguished with precision other degrees of kinship when it wanted to. Mother-in-law, brother-in-law, nephew all appear with their specific terms in different passages of the New Testament. The language had the vocabulary to be precise about family relationships, and it was precise in other cases. That in the specific case of the brothers of Jesus, repeated 4 times by 4 different authors, the word for brother was used systematically. Instead of the available word for cousin is exactly the pattern that Spinoza's historical critical method identifies as evidence against the forced reading. There is also something about the sociology of a first-century Galilean family that makes the existence of brothers not just textually probable but historically necessary. In first-century Galilee, a peasant family from Nazareth was not an isolated nuclear unit. It was a network of obligations, rights, and responsibilities that structured the entire life of the community. The firstborn son had specific duties toward the family, toward the mother, toward younger siblings, toward the preservation of the family name. Jesus was not from an aristocratic or priestly family. He was the son of a carpenter in a small village. If he was an only child, as the doctrine of perpetual virginity implies, his prolonged absences during his ministry would have left his mother in a situation of social vulnerability that no New Testament text suggests. On the contrary, the texts show a mother who can move freely, who has a family accompanying her, who does not depend on the charity of strangers until the final scene of the cross. The presence of brothers in the texts is not just a linguistic fact. It is the picture of a family that functioned as Galilean families of the first century functioned, with all its members, with its internal tensions, with its skeptics and its believers. Now the question every honest person must ask: if the evidence is this clear, how did the church arrive at the opposite position? The answer is not deliberate falsehood. It is more interesting than that, and more human. From the 2nd century onward, within Christianity, a powerful ideal began to grow that the first followers of Jesus did not have: virginity as a spiritually superior state to marriage, not as a personal choice, as a moral hierarchy. The consecrated woman as spiritually superior to the married woman. That ideal clashed directly with something uncomfortable: the idea that the mother of Jesus had led an ordinary married life after his birth. The discomfort produced solutions. The first solution came in an apocryphal text of the 2nd century, written 100 years after the events, called the Proto-Evangelium of James. Its proposal was elegant. Joseph was an older widower with children from a previous marriage. The brothers of Jesus would then be half-brothers, children of Joseph but not of Mary. Mary's virginity remained intact. Notice what just happened. To explain something that first-century readers understood without any conflict, it was necessary to invent in the 2nd century a complete backstory about Joseph's past that no New Testament text mentions. In the English-speaking Protestant world, this particular debate took a specific form that makes the historical critical method especially relevant. The King James Bible, translated in 1611 under explicit instructions that preserved certain ecclesiastical structures, rendered the Greek adelphos as brother with complete literalness. Protestant readers for 4 centuries have been reading the plain text and concluding exactly what the plain text says. The debate about whether brother means cousin is primarily a Catholic theological argument, not a textual one. The second solution, and the one that dominates in Catholicism today, came from a monk named Jerome in the year 383. Jerome, the same man who would later translate the entire Bible into Latin in the version known as the Vulgate, wrote a treatise against a theologian named Helvidius, who argued based on a literal reading of the Gospels that the brothers of Jesus were biological children of Mary and Joseph, born after Jesus. Jerome was not willing to accept even the solution of Joseph's stepchildren. For him, even that option implied Joseph had had previous sexual relations, which was also unacceptable given the ideal of purity surrounding the entire Holy Family. So Jerome proposed a third reading. The brothers of Jesus were actually cousins, sons of a sister of Mary, also named Mary. And to support this, he constructed the argument that the Greek word adelphos, brother, could be used in a broad sense to refer to close relatives, just as the Hebrew word in the Old Testament was sometimes used more loosely. The argument has a real point. In Genesis, Abraham calls his nephew Lot brother several times. Biblical Hebrew was less strict than Greek about this kind of kinship. But there is a fundamental problem with Jerome's argument. The Gospels are not written in Hebrew. They are written in Greek. And in Greek, the precise word for cousin existed. And Paul used it. And he did not use it for James. Jerome knew Greek better than almost anyone in his era. He could not have been unaware of that distinction. What he did was construct the best available argument to support a conclusion his era needed, not the one the text most naturally said. To understand why Jerome wrote what he wrote, you need to understand the intellectual climate of the moment, because it was not an isolated academic discussion. Around the same years in Rome, a monk named Jovinian was causing a related scandal. He argued that marriage and virginity had equal spiritual value before God, that there was no moral hierarchy between the married woman and the consecrated woman. The ecclesiastical hierarchy's response was decisive. Jovinian was condemned as a heretic at a synod in Rome in the year 393. Jerome himself wrote a furious treatise against him, the Adversus Jovinianum, defending the superiority of consecrated virginity over marriage in language that today would strike even many Catholics as extreme. That is the precise intellectual climate in which the discussion about the brothers of Jesus was closed. A moment when the Church was defining with a firm hand that virginity was the highest possible state, and in which the idea that the Mother of God had led an ordinary married life after the birth of Jesus was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain, not because of new textual evidence, but because of the ideal that dominated the era. Spinoza identified this pattern across the entire history of biblical interpretation. First, the theological need, then the reinterpretation of whatever texts were necessary to sustain it. You do not start from the text toward the belief. You start from the belief toward the text, and you adjust whatever needs adjusting along the way. There is one argument that defenders of perpetual virginity do use in their favor, and it deserves to be treated with the same honesty as the rest, not ignored. In the Gospel of John, at the scene of the cross, Jesus sees his mother alongside the beloved disciple and says to her, "Woman, behold your son," and to the disciple, "Behold your mother." From that moment, the disciple took her into his own home. The argument is straightforward. If Mary had living children of her own, why would Jesus entrust her to a disciple rather than leaving her in the care of her own brothers? It is a real argument, not a rhetorical trap. But the same Gospel of John, just a few chapters earlier, had already made clear that his brothers did not believe in him. Entrusting your mother to someone who shares your path, rather than to brothers who at that moment rejected your mission, is not proof that those brothers did not exist. It is perfectly consistent with a family divided in its beliefs, something anyone who has had a religious conviction that their family did not share would understand without difficulty. There is something specific to the English-speaking Protestant tradition that makes this question land differently here than it does in Catholic cultures. The Protestant Reformation, launched by Luther in the 16th century with the principle of Scripture alone, created a tradition in which ordinary believers were expected to read the Bible directly without institutional mediation. The King James Bible, completed in 1611, put the text into the hands of English speakers with a directness that Catholic practice had historically discouraged. The result is that Protestant readers for 4 centuries have been reading the plain text and arriving at the plain conclusion. James is called the brother of the Lord. The word used is adelphos, brother. No asterisk, no footnote, no institutional voice telling them the word means something other than what it says. The debate about whether brother means cousin is primarily a Catholic theological argument constructed by Jerome in the 4th century for reasons that had everything to do with the elevation of virginity as a spiritual ideal and very little to do with what the Greek text most naturally said. Protestant denominations, from the Lutheran to the Reformed to the Baptist traditions, have generally accepted the plain reading. Jesus had brothers. This is one of the rare cases where the plain Protestant reading and the historical critical method arrive at the same conclusion by different routes. There is something about the institutional mechanism of denial that Spinoza analyzed with precision, and that this case illustrates almost perfectly. The institution did not need to falsify any text. It did not need to eliminate any gospel that explicitly said Jesus had biological brothers. It only needed to do 2 subtler and more lasting things. Propose an alternative interpretation of the Greek vocabulary, the cousin theory, and repeat it for enough generations until it stopped looking like an interpretation and started looking like the obvious reading. That is what Spinoza identified as the central mechanism of institutional religious authority. Not direct falsehood, but the management of what is readable, defining which readings are acceptable before the reader opens the text, so that when the reader arrives at the word adelphos in Mark and reads it as brother, something in them already knows that brother in this context means cousin, not because the text says so, because the institution said so first. Something that completes the picture deserves to be stated clearly. The perpetual virginity of Mary did not appear all at once as a definitive dogma. It grew as a popular and theological belief over centuries, reinforced by the Council of Ephesus in the year 431, where Mary was proclaimed Theotokos, the God-bearer, consolidating her status as a nearly divine figure, incompatible in the mentality of the era with an ordinary married life after the birth of Jesus. And the chain continues. The Immaculate Conception, the doctrine that Mary was conceived without original sin, did not become official dogma until the year 1854. The bodily assumption to heaven was not declared dogma until the year 1950. nearly 2,000 years after the events it purports to describe. None of these dogmas appeared with Jesus or with the first apostles. All grew gradually in response to the theological and devotional needs of each era. All required, to a greater or lesser degree, a rereading of texts that did not originally say with that clarity what they ended up meaning centuries later. There is a broader pattern that completes the picture, one that connects the question of the brothers of Jesus to the larger history of how Marian doctrine developed over time. The perpetual virginity of Mary is just one of 4 Marian dogmas that the Catholic Church formalized over the centuries. The divine maternity defined at the Council of Ephesus in 431, perpetual virginity consolidated in the centuries following Jerome, the Immaculate Conception not defined as official dogma until the year 1854, the bodily assumption to heaven not declared dogma until the year 1950. Nearly 2,000 years after the events it purports to describe. None of these dogmas appeared with Jesus or with the first apostles. All grew gradually in response to the theological and devotional needs of each era, and all required, to a greater or lesser degree, a rereading of texts that did not originally say with that clarity what they ended up meaning centuries later. For English-speaking readers, this pattern is visible in real time in the history of American religious culture. The Puritan settlers who founded New England brought with them a theology that placed enormous weight on the literal text of Scripture. Their descendants across the Baptist, Methodist, and evangelical traditions built entire theological systems on the principle that the Bible means what it says. Applied consistently, that principle points directly toward the plain reading. Jesus had brothers. The tension between that principle and institutional doctrine is not new. It has been visible in Christian thought for centuries. What Spinoza's method adds is not a new conclusion. It is a rigorous framework for understanding why the tension exists and what it reveals about the relationship between text and institution. Raymond Brown, one of the most serious Catholic biblical scholars of the 20th century, not an anti-clerical critic, acknowledges openly in his studies on the origins of Christianity that the textual evidence taken on its own favors the reading of biological brothers, and that the cousin theory, while theologically defensible within Catholic faith, is not the most natural reading of the Greek text. When even scholars inside the institution acknowledge this, the argument stops being a controversy between believers and skeptics. It becomes a discussion about what an honest person does when the evidence points in one direction and the doctrine points in another. That is exactly what Spinoza faced in his own life. At 23, he was excommunicated by his own Jewish community in Amsterdam for holding ideas that cast doubt on established readings of sacred texts. The cherem issued against him is one of the harshest on record from that era. It forbade anyone from speaking to him, coming within 4 cubits of his body, or reading anything he wrote. Spinoza did not recant, and years later, in the theological political treatise, he defended with complete clarity something that today seems obvious but was radical in his time: that any person has the right to read a sacred text with their own rational tools, without an institutional authority dictating in advance what that text can only mean. There is a tradition within English-speaking culture itself that anticipated Spinoza's method, and that gets almost no attention in the mainstream telling of Christian history. Thomas Jefferson, the 3rd President of the United States, principal author of the Declaration of Independence, produced what became known as the Jefferson Bible. He took a razor to the Gospels and cut out every miraculous element, keeping only the moral teaching he attributed to the historical Jesus. He worked in silence, privately, knowing the political cost of publishing it openly. But he did it. And what he did was exactly what Spinoza had argued every person had the right to do: read the sacred text with their own rational tools, without institutional authority dictating the only permissible interpretation. The question of the brothers of Jesus sits squarely in that tradition. It is not an attack imported from outside Christian culture. It is the application of a method of honest reading that has roots in the Enlightenment, in the Protestant Reformation, and most rigorously in Spinoza's theological political treatise. A tradition that says, the text means what it says, in the language in which it was written, until there is a compelling reason to think otherwise. And in this case, the only compelling reason offered Jerome's cousin theory turns out to rest on a distinction between Hebrew and Greek usage that collapses the moment you notice that the Greek word for cousin was available, known, and not used. Before the mantra, something that Spinoza would want to say directly to the person watching this video who feels that something they always believed is being questioned. You are not being asked to abandon faith. You are being asked to do something different and, in a sense, more demanding, to distinguish between genuine faith and institutional doctrine, between what the text says and what someone decided the text should say, between authentic spiritual experience and theological interpretation constructed in the 4th century under pressures that had nothing to do with the search for historical truth. The faith that survives honest examination of evidence is more solid than the faith that needs to be protected from questions. A God who requires you not to read carefully what his own texts say is not a God who deserves much confidence. A God who withstands honest examination, who can be read with rigor without collapsing, is something else entirely. Something worth adding about James specifically, because his story has a dimension that connects directly to the English-speaking world's understanding of religious authority. James was martyred. The high priest Ananus convened an illegal tribunal and had him executed. Josephus records that the most respected Jews in Jerusalem were outraged, not because they were followers of Jesus, but because Ananus had violated due process to eliminate a man whose moral reputation was beyond reproach. Even his enemies acknowledged his integrity. That detail matters for the English-speaking Protestant tradition specifically. James represents something that the Reformation claimed to recover. A form of Christian leadership grounded in moral authority rather than institutional hierarchy. He was not appointed by succession. He was not elected by a council. He led because of who he was and what he stood for. And he was identified by his own community and by an outside historian as the brother of Jesus. The institution that later decided he was only a cousin had every reason to minimize that connection. A biological brother of Jesus carries a kind of authority that no institutional appointment can replicate. A cousin does not. That is what Spinoza believed, and he paid the highest price his world could charge for believing it. The mantra that captures what this exploration reveals. When the text says one thing and the doctrine says another, the question is not who to believe. The question is why someone needed the text to say something different. Now you know the 4 texts. You know the 2 theories the church constructed to explain them. You know the Greek word that was available and not used. And you know the precise historical climate in which the discussion was closed. The next time someone tells you the Bible never mentions brothers of Jesus, you know that is simply not accurate. What exists is a later reading built with considerable erudition and considerable theological necessity to make the Bible say something different from what its earliest readers most likely understood. Write in the comments what you think after watching this video, and tell us what country you are watching from. The next video is waiting for you on screen right now, chosen specifically to take everything you understood today one level further. There is something almost ironic in the fact that it is precisely Spinoza's method that helps resolve this question. Because Spinoza lived in his own body what it means for a religious community to decide what can and cannot be read in a sacred text. He paid for it with total exile, with his family erased, with his community erased. And he kept reading anyway, with honesty, with precision, without asking permission. That is exactly what this video invites you to do. Not to accept any reading from memory. To open the text and read it yourself with the same clarity Spinoza taught us to read it nearly 4 centuries ago.